I want to bring in Paul Rieckhoff, the founder and CEO of Independent Veterans of America and host of the Independent Americans podcast. And Paul, first of all, thank you for being here. And I want to play some more about what John Kelly says. In this case, it's about Donald Trump's feelings as he knows them toward veterans. Take a listen.
Does he have disdain for the disabled?
Well, certainly his not wanting to be seen with amputees that lost their limbs in defense of this country, fighting for every American, to him included, to protect them, that didn't want to be seen with them. That's an interesting perspective for the commander-in-chief to have.
Why didn't he want to be seen with them?
He would just say, look, it doesn't look good for me.
And to repeat what Peter pointed out, this is a four-star general who is saying this. There are voters, and we know this because we've talked to them, who just see this as more of the same, or maybe he doesn't really mean it, right? What do you hear when you hear that?
I hear a four-star general who lost his son to a landmine in Afghanistan. His son died in service of this country. So when he thinks about making a decision to go public and have his voice in the record so the whole world can hear, I think it may be John Kelly, the father, stepping out of the role as four-star general and making sure that the country understands how high the stakes are. And we can't ever normalize any of this because the world is watching and our enemies are watching. When they see a headline like Trump praises Hitler, Trump attacks wounded veterans, Trump fights with Arlington Cemetery, our enemies are celebrating. This is a good news day for Vladimir Putin, who wants to see our country ripped apart, who wants to see the former commander-in-chief attack people in his own country. This is a field day for our enemies. And I think we have to remember that beyond the politics, there is a very important national security environment, and the entire world and all our allies are watching this chaos. And we should never normalize it because this is not normal. And we're talking about not just a president, but potentially electing a commander-in-chief who will be the authority over our entire military and the sons and daughters of people who are watching. If you've got a son or daughter that's in uniform, that's going to be their boss if he's elected.
A commander-in-chief at a time of war, right? We have wars in the Middle East. We have a war in Ukraine. The Atlantic Council International Affairs Group cautions that the U.S. will indeed be electing a wartime president. And in reality, they say this is not a prediction. It is where we are. Does that change the stakes?
Yes. Absolutely. I mean, we're talking about adversaries with nukes. We're talking about multiple regions around the world with conflict. Just today, the Pentagon released information about American troops that were wounded in Iraq because they're fighting ISIS there. We're engaged around the world in Yemen and Syria. We've got troops in harm's way right now. It's often below the radar, but American men and women are in uniform and dying, and they need a commander-in-chief who respects them, respects their diversity, who honors them, who appreciates their sacrifice, and take a step back, too. This is not just General Kelly. It is basically every senior military and foreign policy official who ever served under Donald Trump. It's people like McChrystal. It's people like Dick Cheney, the former Secretary of Defense. He wasn't just a vice president. He was the Secretary of Defense who have now aligned against Trump. And they're all ringing the alarm. They're all saying the same thing. This is about our national security and the future of our country, and everyone should be concerned.
So, Yvonne, the Trump campaign, and we read their statement pushing back against these reports, calling John Kelly a liar. But have we heard anything from Donald Trump himself?
At this point in time, I think it's important to be clear here, Chris, is that Donald Trump is not running away from his denigration of his former chief of staff, John Kelly, or the likes of James Mattis, his former Pentagon secretary, or Mark Milley, the former chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Donald Trump instead is using his cavalier attacks against his perceived political enemies, from Liz Cheney to Barack Obama to Liz Cheney and Joe Biden, to his attacks on these military leaders who served in his administration, to calling for the major news organizations, CBS, ABC, NBC, to have their licenses taken away from their ability to broadcast on television. This was all last night in the aftermath of this conversation that John Kelly had with Michael Schmidt at the New York Times. And I think it's important to note, because Donald Trump is not trying to present himself as a uniter for the United States. Instead, he is using this and his own unique authoritative leadership, right? And talking about how he would solve immigration, he says you don't need a bill, you need a president. He has suggested that America needs a dictator for a day. Donald Trump is not necessarily running away from the characterizations that are being described by the likes of John Kelly about him. Instead, he is going on the attack against leaders like him and James Mattis and Mark Milley to suggest that it's because of them that the United States finds itself in, his words, a weak position. Take a listen to him in front of thousands last night in North Carolina at a rally.
I think what happened is when Putin saw how weak we were, how pathetic we were, with the stupid Milley and these generals that aren't even generals as far as I was concerned. What a stupid group of people they were. Mattis, Milley, you know, the real ones, the ones that I used to defeat ISIS. We defeated ISIS. They were the real generals.
Donald Trump, Chris, is campaigning against these generals. I want to make that very clear. This was last night at his campaign rally in North Carolina with now less than 2 weeks left. He's going to be making his way to Georgia. And again, Donald Trump is saying all of this publicly. It's not a political candidate who we have been used to seeing over the last century in the United States of America. Yet he is speaking the words about how he would even like to see the military be used. Just the other day, he suggested that come Election Day, that the military and the National Guard should be ready to come to action if the political left, his enemies, try to rig the election again. It's not clear what he means by that, if he's suggesting the military leaders should disobey the Biden administration's orders and act rogue or independent of the administration. But these are words of Donald Trump here in real time, 2 weeks out from Election Day.
Amy, then there is the story of a 20-year-old Army private, daughter of Mexican immigrants, killed at Fort Hood in 2020. Trump said publicly he would help pay for her funeral. And then later that year, he asked about the cost. The Atlantic reports that according to attendees and to contemporaneous notes of the meeting taken by a participant, an aide answered, yes, we received a bill. The funeral cost $60,000. Trump became angry. It doesn't cost $60,000 to bury an effing Mexican. He turned to his chief of staff, Mark Meadows, and issued an order. Don't pay it. Later that day, he was still agitated. Can you believe it, he said, according to a witness. Effing people trying to rip me off. I want to note again that Trump spokesperson says that's a lie. Trump never said any of that. But there are other examples of Trump dehumanizing certain segments of the population. So when you hear that reporting by The Atlantic, what do you hear?
Look, the dehumanizing language targeting Mexicans, immigrants, we've heard from him and from, frankly, a number of other right-wing public figures over and over again in recent years. It has become wholly normalized in our political rhetoric, and it goes hand in hand with the anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, the white supremacist and racist conspiracy theories we've been talking about. And ultimately, it's intended to sow distrust in our democracy by pitting communities against one another, dehumanizing, finding scapegoats, and ultimately creating division in a way that is intended to undermine our democracy and our institutions. And so we need to understand how it fits into this broader narrative. We talked earlier about the cycle of violence that this sort of rhetoric leads to. As we come up on the anniversary of the Pittsburgh attack, it was an attack that targeted both the Jewish community directly, but was fueled also by an anti-immigrant sentiment, where the shooter specifically used a lot of similar language to what we just heard from former President Trump and other politicians dehumanizing immigrants and believing that Jews were orchestrating the replacement of the white race by bringing them into this country, by replacing our electorate. And so, again, we need to fully understand that none of these things are happening in a silo. The anti-immigrant, anti-Mexican rhetoric that he espoused in this case goes hand in hand with the broader, increasingly normalized bigotry and extremism, and all of it is meant in service of undermining our democracy.
And Paul, I think it's worth noting that we are talking about a young woman who made a choice. You choose now to serve in the military. Nobody is drafting you. She made a choice. She was horribly murdered. And it's reduced to an effing Mexican. Do you think that with the larger community, it used to be the military was sacred if you were a politician, right? Mm-hmm. And maybe even just with people who are part of the military family, it makes a difference when they hear that.
I hope so.
Who they vote for.
I hope so. It should, because this is going to be the man who could be in charge of your daughter or your son, setting the tone, setting the example. Vanessa Guillen was more than just a single soldier that was murdered. She sparked a movement. The Vanessa Guillen Act was passed. It was some of the most significant reform around military sexual trauma and sexual assault in history. There was a tremendous movement to find her, to seek justice. So this is a very important symbol for the reform that is overdue, especially in regard to safeguarding women in uniform. So to have Trump hit this story and this person in this way is especially egregious and outrageous and cuts to the core of who he is. This is outrageous, and he has to be in charge of the most diverse military on the planet. How can he do that when he speaks about so many people in this country like that?